I used to believe birthdays meant something. Maybe not huge parties or expensive gifts, but at least a small moment where the people who raised you showed they cared. Growing up, my birthdays had always been quiet, sometimes forgotten entirely, but when my parents told me they wanted to celebrate my 25th birthday with a dinner at their house, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Come over Saturday evening, my mother had said on the phone earlier that week. We're making a proper dinner. A proper dinner. Those words alone were unusual enough to make me curious. When I arrived that night, the house looked exactly the same as it always had, perfectly neat, almost cold. My mother had set the dining table with her expensive china, the kind she usually only used when guests came over. My father was already sitting at the table with a glass of wine. "You're late," he said as I walked in. "It's 7 on the dot," I replied. My mother forced a smile. "Sit down. Dinner's ready." Something about the atmosphere felt strange. There was no birthday cake, no decorations, not even a simple happy birthday. Just dinner. We started eating in silence. The only sounds in the room were forks touching plates and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, my father cleared his throat and lifted his wine glass. "Well," he said, "you're 25 now." I nodded slowly. "Yeah." My parents exchanged a glance, one of those silent conversations people have when they already know what the other is thinking. Then my mother leaned back in her chair. "We figured," she said casually, "that since you're an adult now, it's time you knew the truth." I frowned. "The truth about what?" My father didn't hesitate. "About why we kept you." The sentence confused me instantly. "What do you mean?" My mother sighed like she was explaining something obvious. "When you were born, we weren't planning on raising a child." I felt my stomach tighten. My father took a sip of wine and continued calmly. "But financially, it made more sense to keep you." I blinked, trying to process what he had just said. "Financially?" My mother nodded. "The tax benefits," she said. "The deductions helped us a lot in those early years." For a moment, I thought I misheard her. "You're joking," I said quietly. Neither of them laughed. My father simply shrugged. "It wasn't personal," he said. "It was practical." The words landed like a hammer in my chest. 25 years of memories suddenly rearranged themselves in my mind. Every cold birthday, every distant conversation, every time they acted like I was more of a burden than a child. I stared at them, hoping for some sign that this was some kind of cruel joke. There was none. "So, you're telling me," I said slowly, "that the only reason you raised me," my mother finished the sentence without emotion, "was because it helped with taxes." Silence swallowed the room. My hands started shaking under the table. I pushed my chair back and stood up. Neither of them tried to stop me. Neither of them even looked guilty. As I walked toward the door, my father called out one last thing. "You should be grateful, you know. We still gave you a decent life." I paused for a second, then I looked back at them. And for the first time in my life, I realized something. I had never actually had parents. Only two people who had been doing accounting. Without saying another word, I walked out the door into the cold night. And that was the moment my life truly began. I didn't remember much about the drive after I left my parents' house. The roads blurred together under the dim glow of streetlights, and the silence inside my car felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. "We only kept you for the tax benefits." The sentence kept repeating in my head like a broken recording. For 25 years, I had tried to understand why my parents always felt so distant. Other kids grew up with hugs, encouragement, and parents who showed up to school events. Mine showed up to nothing. When I got good grades, they simply nodded. When I graduated college, my father just said, "Good. Now you won't be financially dependent." At the time, I thought they were just strict, maybe emotionally reserved. But now everything made sense. I wasn't raised out of love. I was a financial calculation. After driving aimlessly for nearly an hour, I pulled into a small diner on the side of the road. The neon sign buzzed faintly in the night as I parked. Inside, only a few people sat scattered across the booths. A tired waitress poured coffee for a truck driver while an old radio played quietly behind the counter. I slid into a booth near the window. "Coffee?" the waitress asked. "Yeah," I replied. She poured it into a chipped white mug and walked away, without asking any questions. I was grateful for that. I stared at my reflection in the dark window, while the steam from the coffee curled upward. For most of my life, I had worked hard for one simple reason. I wanted my parents to finally be proud of me. Every achievement, every late night studying, every risk I took starting my own consulting business was secretly driven by the hope that one day they might look at me differently. Maybe smile. Maybe say, "We're proud of you." But tonight had erased that hope completely. I took a slow sip of coffee and let out a long breath. For the first time in my life, I asked myself a question I had never considered before. What if I stopped trying to impress them? The thought felt strange, but also freeing. I pulled out my phone and opened my email. Dozens of unread messages appeared instantly. Most of them were from clients. 2 years earlier, I had started a small investment consulting business after leaving my corporate job. At first, it was just freelance work, helping a few small entrepreneurs manage their money. But things had grown faster than I expected. Much faster. I now had clients across 3 different states, and some of them controlled serious wealth. Over the past year, my reputation had quietly spread among investors who valued someone young, careful, and willing to take calculated risks. Ironically, my parents had never once asked about my business. As far as they knew, I was still figuring things out. I suddenly laughed softly. They had absolutely no idea who I had become. And maybe that was a good thing, because if they had known, they might have realized something important. The quiet child they only kept for tax benefits had grown into someone far more powerful than they ever imagined. And the moment that realization finally hit them, I had a feeling it would be unforgettable. The weeks after my birthday dinner passed in complete silence. I didn't call my parents. I didn't text them. I didn't even drive past their neighborhood. At first, I wondered if they might reach out, maybe to apologize or at least explain what they meant that night. But days turned into weeks, and my phone remained completely quiet. Part of me wasn't surprised. If they had spent 25 years treating me like a financial asset, why would they suddenly start acting like parents now? Instead of wasting time thinking about them, I focused on work. And work was going better than ever. My investment consulting business had grown steadily over the last 2 years, but recently it had started gaining serious attention. One of my clients, a tech entrepreneur named Daniel, had recommended me to several of his friends, and suddenly I was advising people who managed millions of dollars. It still felt surreal sometimes. Just 3 years earlier, I had been sitting in a small cubicle at a corporate finance firm, working 80-hour weeks for a boss who barely remembered my name. Now I worked for myself. I chose my clients. And most importantly, I controlled my own future. One afternoon, Daniel invited me to a private investor meeting downtown. "It's just a small group," he told me over the phone. "Some people looking for opportunities. You should come." Networking was always useful, so I agreed. The meeting was held in a sleek glass office building overlooking the city. Inside the conference room, about a dozen investors sat around a long table while a large screen displayed presentations about potential companies needing funding. Most of the businesses were typical startups, tech platforms, real estate projects, and manufacturing companies looking to expand. I listened carefully, occasionally taking notes. Then one particular presentation caught my attention. A logistics company seeking emergency investment. The presenter explained that the company had been struggling financially for several years due to poor management and rising operational costs. Without new investors, it would likely collapse within 6 months. As the company's name appeared on the screen, my entire body froze. I knew that name very well. It was my parents' company. I stared at the screen as the presenter continued explaining their situation. According to the financial report, the company was drowning in debt. Several major investors had already pulled out, and the board was desperately searching for new funding to keep the business alive. Suddenly, all the pieces started falling into place. Growing up, my parents had always complained about money. They were constantly stressed about business expenses, loans, and financial pressure. Now I understood just how bad things had become. Their company was failing, and they were running out of time. Most of the investors around the table seemed uninterested. A struggling logistics company wasn't exactly the most exciting opportunity, but I saw something different. Possibility. As the presentation ended, Daniel leaned toward me. "Not worth the risk," he whispered. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I kept staring at the screen where my parents' company logo still glowed faintly. For the first time since that painful birthday dinner, a strange idea began forming in my mind. An idea that slowly turned into a plan. Because my parents thought they knew exactly who I was. To them, I was still the quiet kid they kept around for tax deductions. But what they didn't realize was that their failing company had just become the perfect opportunity for someone like me. And if things went exactly the way I was starting to imagine, my parents were about to discover a very expensive mistake. The moment I got home after the investor meeting, I opened my laptop. My parents' company logo was still burned into my mind from the presentation screen. I hadn't thought about their business in years, mostly because they never talked to me about it unless they were complaining. But now, curiosity, and something deeper, pushed me to look closer. Within minutes, I found their financial reports. The situation was worse than I expected. The company had been losing money for nearly 3 years. Rising transportation costs, poor management decisions, and several bad contracts had slowly drained their resources. On top of that, they had taken multiple loans just to keep operations running. The numbers didn't lie. If nothing changed, the company would likely collapse within 6 months. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Most investors would see this as a disaster. But I saw something different. Opportunity. When companies get desperate, they start making decisions they normally wouldn't. They accept deals they would have rejected years earlier. And right now, my parents were clearly desperate. Over the next few days, I dug deeper into the company's structure. I studied shareholder information, board members, outstanding debts, and ownership percentages. The more I researched, the clearer the picture became. My parents still owned a large portion of the company, but several smaller investors also held shares. If someone slowly started buying those shares, control of the company could eventually shift. Quietly, without attracting much attention. A slow smile spread across my face. The plan forming in my mind felt almost too perfect. But I couldn't do it alone. The next step required someone with experience in corporate acquisitions. So I called one of my clients, a businessman named Victor, who specialized in buying struggling companies and turning them around. We met the next afternoon in his office. I placed the financial reports on the table. "What do you think?" I asked. Victor flipped through the pages carefully. After a few minutes, he leaned back in his chair. "Risky," he said, "but not impossible." I nodded. "I'm not interested in saving the company," I replied calmly. Victor raised an eyebrow. "Then what are you interested in?" I looked directly at him. Control. For a moment, he studied my face, trying to understand my motivation. Then he slowly smiled. "You're serious?" "Completely." Victor tapped the folder with his finger. "If we do this, we'd need to move carefully," he said. "Buy shares through different channels. Slowly build ownership without alerting the current leadership." That's exactly what I was thinking. He closed the folder and leaned forward. "One more question," he said. "Why this company?" I hesitated for just a moment. Then I told him the truth. Because the people running it once told me they only kept me for tax benefits. Victor stared at me in silence. Then he laughed quietly. "Well," he said, "that's definitely a unique motivation." Over the next hour, we discussed the strategy in detail. We would form a small investment group. Through multiple investors and private deals, we would begin quietly buying shares from smaller stakeholders who were already nervous about the company's future. Piece by piece, week by week. Eventually, if everything went according to plan, we would own enough to control the company. And the best part? My parents wouldn't even realize what was happening. Not until it was far too late. As I left Victor's office that afternoon, I felt something new growing inside me. Not anger, not sadness. Something colder. Something more focused. For 25 years, my parents had treated me like a financial asset. Now, without even realizing it, They were about to become one. The first share purchase happened 2 weeks later. Victor handled most of the technical details, setting up the investment group through a small private firm that wouldn't attract attention. On paper, it looked like a few independent investors were simply showing interest in a struggling logistics company. In reality, every decision led back to one person.
Me.
We started small. A minor shareholder who had already lost confidence in the company agreed to sell his portion quietly. It wasn't a large percentage, but it was the first piece of the puzzle. Then another investor sold. Then another. Each time, the shares moved into accounts connected to our investment group. The process was slow and careful, exactly how Victor said it needed to be. If we move too fast, the board will notice, he warned during one of our meetings. The moment they realize someone is collecting shares, they'll start asking questions. So, we moved quietly,
Week by week. Piece by piece.
Meanwhile, life continued as normal. My consulting business kept growing, and I spent most of my days meeting with clients, reviewing portfolios, and studying market trends. But every night, before going to bed, I opened the same spreadsheet. The one tracking our ownership percentage in my parents' company. 10%, 14%, 19%. Each new number felt strangely satisfying. Not because I wanted revenge in the dramatic sense. I wasn't interested in yelling at them or humiliating them publicly. But I wanted them to understand something. Actions have consequences. One evening, about 2 months into the plan, Victor called me. "You're going to like this," he said. "What happened?" 2 major investors just backed out of the company completely. They're scared the business will collapse. And they're willing to sell their shares cheaply. I felt my pulse quicken. How much are we talking about? Enough to push us past 40% ownership. For a moment, I didn't speak. 40% meant we would become the largest single shareholder group. Victor must have sensed my excitement. "This is the turning point," he said. "Once we reach majority ownership, control of the board becomes possible." "Let's do it," I replied immediately. The deal closed within a week. When I updated the spreadsheet that night, the number changed again. 38%. Then 44%. Then finally, 51%. I stared at the screen in silence. Majority control. Technically, the company still operated under the same leadership, my parents and their executive team, but now every major decision required approval from the majority shareholders. And that majority was now us. Still, Victor advised patience. "Don't rush the next step," he told me. "Let things settle. They still don't know who we are." That part almost made me laugh. My parents had spent decades believing they controlled everything. Their business, their money, their future. What they didn't realize was that the ground beneath them had already shifted. 3 months after my 25th birthday, the board scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss the company's financial crisis and new investors. Victor sent me the details.
Date. Time.
Location. I read the message twice before closing my laptop. For weeks, my parents had been negotiating with investors, hoping someone would save their failing company. They thought help was coming.
In a way,
they were right. But the person walking into that meeting wasn't the investor they expected. It was the child they once said was only worth keeping for tax benefits. And when they finally saw me sitting at that conference table, their entire world was about to change. The board meeting was scheduled for Monday morning at 10. I arrived 15 minutes early. The corporate office building looked exactly how I remembered it from years ago. Tall glass windows, polished floors, and the quiet tension that always seemed to exist in places where people were worried about money. As I walked through the lobby, a strange calm settled over me. 3 months earlier, I had walked out of my parents' house feeling like my entire life had collapsed. Now I was walking into their company as the person who controlled it. Victor had already arrived and was waiting near the conference room. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly. I nodded. More than ready. Inside the room, several board members were already seated around the long table. Papers were spread everywhere, and the mood felt tense. Everyone knew the company was in trouble, but they believed today's meeting would bring hope. After all, new investors had stepped in. What they didn't know was who those investors really were. A few minutes later, the door opened again. My parents walked in together. My father looked stressed, his face tired from weeks of financial pressure. My mother followed behind him, flipping through a folder of documents. Neither of them noticed me at first. They were too busy discussing numbers with one of the board members. Then my father looked up and froze. For a moment, he simply stared at me like he was trying to understand what he was seeing. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply. The room fell silent. Several board members looked back and forth between us, confused. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I calmly took a seat at the table and placed a folder in front of me. My mother's eyes narrowed. "This meeting is for investors and executives," she said coldly. "You shouldn't be here." Victor leaned forward slightly. "Actually," he said, "he should." My father frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" I finally spoke. "It means I'm one of the investors." The confusion around the table instantly deepened. "That's impossible," my father snapped. "You don't have the money for something like this." I slid the folder across the table toward him. Inside were the official documents showing ownership percentages and shareholder transfers. My father opened it. As he read the first page, the color slowly drained from his face. My mother grabbed the papers from his hands. Her eyes moved quickly across the numbers. Then she looked up at me with pure disbelief. This can't be right. But it was. Victor spoke calmly to the board. "Our investment group currently owns 51% of the company." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Majority ownership.
Control.
My father stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly across the floor. "You planned this," he said, staring at me. I met his gaze without emotion. "You told me the truth on my birthday," I replied. "I just decided to do something useful with it." My mother's voice shook with anger. "You're trying to destroy us." I shook my head slowly.
No.
Then I leaned back in my chair. "I'm trying to fix a bad investment." The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. For 25 years, my parents had believed they were the ones making all the important decisions. But that era had just ended. And they were only beginning to realize it. Because this meeting wasn't just about new investors. It was about new leadership. And for the first time in their lives, they weren't the ones in control anymore. The tension in the conference room was thick enough to feel. No one spoke for several seconds after Victor announced that our investment group owned 51% of the company. The board members exchanged nervous looks while my parents stood frozen near the table. My father was the first to break the silence. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "There has to be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Victor replied calmly. My father looked back down at the documents in his hands, flipping through the pages faster now, as if hoping the numbers would magically change. They didn't. Every signed agreement, every ownership transfer, every share purchase was clearly listed. My mother slowly sat down, her face pale. "You went behind our backs," she said, staring at me. I shrugged slightly. "That's how investments usually work." Her eyes filled with anger. "You're our son." I held her gaze. "You said I was a tax benefit." The room fell silent again. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was clear they were starting to understand that this wasn't just a business conflict. This was personal. My father slammed the folder shut. "You think buying shares gives you the right to walk in here and take over?" "That's exactly what it means," Victor said. The board chairman cleared his throat and tried to bring the meeting back to order. "Let's remain professional," he said. "If the investment group truly holds majority ownership, then we must follow proper governance procedures." My father looked furious. "This company is my life's work. And now it belongs to the shareholders," the chairman replied carefully. I leaned forward slightly. "We're not here to destroy the company," I said. "We're here to save it." The chairman nodded. "Then we should proceed with the vote." My parents both looked shocked. "What vote?" my mother asked. The chairman opened another document. "With the financial state of the company, the board must decide whether leadership changes are necessary." My father's face turned red. "You can't seriously be considering this." But the board members looked uncertain. They had seen the financial reports. They knew the company was collapsing under its current leadership. One by one, they began reviewing the proposal placed in front of them. A proposal that suggested immediate changes to executive management. My father turned toward me, his voice filled with disbelief. You planned this entire thing just to humiliate us. I shook my head. No, I said quietly. I planned it to protect my investment. That answer seemed to anger him even more. For years, he had viewed everything through a financial lens. Now someone was using the same logic against him. The chairman finally spoke again. All board members, please cast your vote. The room became completely silent as each person wrote their decision. A few moments later, the chairman collected the papers. He read them carefully before looking up. The vote has passed. My mother's hands gripped the edge of the table. What does that mean? She whispered. The chairman took a slow breath. It means that effective immediately, the board has decided to remove current executive leadership. My father stared at him in shock. You're firing me? The chairman nodded slightly. As CEO, yes. No one moved. No one spoke. For the first time in my life, I saw something in my parents' eyes that I had never seen before. They looked powerless. And the strange part was, they had created this situation themselves. Because the moment they told me I was nothing more than a financial benefit, they unknowingly taught me exactly how their world worked. And now I was simply playing by their rules. The meeting ended in complete silence. Most of the board members left the conference room quickly, clearly uncomfortable with what had just happened. Victor stayed behind for a moment, gathering the documents, while I remained seated in my chair. Across the room, my parents still hadn't moved. My father stood frozen near the table, staring down at the papers as if they might suddenly change. My mother looked completely stunned, her hands resting weakly on the back of a chair. For the first time in my life, they looked unsure of themselves. Finally, my father spoke. This isn't over, he muttered. His voice no longer carried the confidence it once had. I stood up calmly and closed the folder in front of me. It actually is, I replied. That seemed to snap my mother out of her shock. She walked quickly toward me, her heels echoing sharply on the conference room floor. You can't do this to us, she said. I looked at her quietly. I didn't do anything, I said. The board made the decision. You forced the decision, she argued. Victor stepped forward slightly. The board voted based on financial performance, he said calmly. The company was losing money under the current leadership. My father suddenly slammed his fist against the table. I built this company from nothing, he shouted. And now it's failing, I answered. The words hung heavily in the air. For years, my parents had spoken to me with cold logic, always focused on practical outcomes instead of emotions. Now I was doing the same thing. My mother's eyes filled with frustration. You're supposed to be our son, she said. I tilted my head slightly. Am I? Neither of them answered. The silence between us was painfully familiar. Finally, my father pointed toward the door. Get out, he said to me. I almost laughed at that. This is my company now, I reminded him. Victor cleared his throat politely. Technically, the majority shareholder group controls executive decisions moving forward. My father looked like he might explode. You think money makes you powerful? He asked bitterly. I thought about that for a moment. Then I gave him an honest answer. No, I said. But you taught me that money makes decisions. That sentence seemed to hit him harder than anything else I had said, because it was true. Growing up, every conversation in our house revolved around finances, investments, profits, and losses. Even my existence had been reduced to a tax deduction. Now the same logic had come back to them. My mother's voice softened slightly. You're destroying this family. I met her eyes. You said we were never a family. Neither of them could argue with that. After a long pause, my father grabbed his coat and headed toward the door. My mother followed him slowly. Just before leaving, she turned back toward me. For a moment, it looked like she wanted to say something. Maybe an apology. Maybe anger. But in the end, she said nothing. The door closed behind them. Victor walked over and placed a hand on the table. Well, he said quietly, that went better than expected. I exhaled slowly. For years, I had imagined confronting my parents about the way they treated me. But strangely, I didn't feel angry anymore. Just calm. Because the truth was simple. They had spent 25 years treating me like a financial decision. Now they were finally experiencing what that felt like. Life at the company changed quickly after that meeting. Within a few days, the board approved a complete restructuring plan. Several experienced executives were brought in to stabilize operations, reduce unnecessary expenses, and rebuild damaged partnerships. Victor helped oversee the transition, while I stayed mostly in the background. I had never planned to run the company myself. This wasn't about becoming CEO. It was about control. And more importantly, it was about proving something to them and to myself. For years, my parents had believed they were the smartest people in every room. They always spoke about business like it was a game only they understood. But their company had been collapsing for years because of poor decisions they refused to admit. Now professionals were fixing those mistakes. Within 6 months, the company's finances began improving. Several new logistics contracts were signed, and costs were reduced significantly. For the first time in years, the business was actually becoming stable again. But the biggest change wasn't happening in the financial reports. It was happening in the office. My parents were still there, just not in the roles they once had. Instead of executives with private offices and assistants, they now worked regular management positions under the new leadership team. Technically, the board had allowed them to remain employees because they still had experience in the industry. But they no longer had power. No more boardroom authority. No more final decisions. Just instructions from people who now outranked them. The first time I saw them after the board meeting was about 2 months later. I had stopped by the office to review progress with the new executive team. As I walked through the hallway, I noticed my father standing near a desk reviewing shipping documents. For a moment, he didn't see me. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. Then he looked up. Our eyes met. The silence between us lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Neither of us spoke. Eventually, he simply looked back down at the paperwork in front of him. I kept walking. That brief moment told me everything. The man who once controlled the entire company was now just another employee trying to finish his daily tasks. My mother had it even harder. She used to manage executive operations, making high-level decisions with the board. Now she worked in a mid-level administrative role under a supervisor 20 years younger than her. From what Victor told me, she rarely spoke during meetings anymore. Most of the time, she simply followed instructions. One evening, Victor and I reviewed the latest financial reports. The turnaround is impressive, he said. At this rate, the company will be profitable again within a year. I nodded slowly. It was strange. I had spent so many years wanting my parents to notice me, to be proud of me. But now that everything had changed, I didn't need their approval anymore. Because the truth was clear. The child they once considered nothing more than a tax benefit had ended up saving the very company they built. The irony was almost unbelievable. And the most interesting part? They knew it. Every day they walked into that office, they were reminded of one simple fact. The person they underestimated the most was now the reason their company still existed. A year had passed since that fateful birthday dinner, and I had finally reached a place of calm I hadn't felt in decades. The company was thriving again under the new leadership team. Profits were rising, contracts were secure, and employee morale was improving. Most importantly, my parents were no longer running the show. They had learned the hard way that decisions have consequences, and that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who matter most. It was my 26th birthday. I didn't expect any celebration this year. After all, the last birthday had been a turning point in my life, one I would never forget. Around noon, I received a text from my mother. "Can we have dinner tonight?" I stared at the phone for a long moment. The words seemed innocent enough, but I knew better. She wasn't asking because she wanted to celebrate me. She was probably hoping for reconciliation, or maybe even trying to regain some semblance of control. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I placed the phone on the table and took a deep breath. For 25 years, I had lived under their rules, under their judgment, under the belief that their approval mattered. I had chased it relentlessly, trying to earn a love that didn't exist. And then, in one evening, they shattered that illusion entirely. Now, I finally understood something important. I didn't need their approval. I never had. I smiled quietly. No, I texted back. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It was clarity. It was closure. I spent the rest of the day reviewing the company's quarterly reports. Everything looked perfect. Every department was performing better than expected, every client was satisfied, and every employee felt secure. I had turned the chaos my parents had ignored into stability. And in doing so, I realized the ultimate truth about my parents' birthday declaration. They had told me I was nothing more than a tax benefit. But in reality, that statement had set me free. For years, I had allowed their words to define me. But that night at 25 taught me the most important lesson. No one else controls your value. Only you do. By the time the sun set, I was sitting on my balcony, sipping tea, and watching the city lights blink on. I thought about the last year, the anger, the planning, the strategy, and finally the outcome. I hadn't just gained control of the company. I had gained control of my life. My parents had taught me a valuable lesson, even if they didn't intend to. Underestimate someone at your own peril. For the first time in my life, I felt truly powerful, not because of revenge or spite, but because I knew my worth. They had reduced me to a financial number, and I had transformed that into my greatest victory. That night, I didn't need apologies or acknowledgement from my parents. I didn't need validation. All I needed was the satisfaction of knowing that my life, my career, my future, my worth was mine. And as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I allowed myself a final thought. The child they once believed was worth only a tax benefit had become the person who had the final say over everything they had built. And for me, that was enough. No yelling, no revenge plots, just quiet, undeniable triumph. For the first time in my life, I was free. If you want, I can now create a viral thumbnail with a female character, 200-character story highlight, hook line, and a full SEO pack with tags and hashtags to make this story ready for YouTube or social media. Do you want me to do that next?